Yeah, thanks Hakam for that. Okay. Yeah, so lab sessions start this week. That's correct. But remember what we said last time about how labs work is that they start the week before the actual sessions start, right? So, well, lab 0 is special case because last week was the first week of the semester. But for example, lab 1 is starting from next Monday, right? Next week, you don't have any lab sessions, but you have office hours to get help with the lab. You can start on your own. You will already have the lab document this Friday. So what I usually do is Friday is your deadline to submit lab 0. I will also post the lab document for lab 1. So you should be able to start. And then from Monday, we would have the regular office hours to get help. You are encouraged to start your lab as early as possible, but we don't have any lab sessions until the week before. So the lab sessions usually run the second week of the 2-week period of the lab. I hope this does not confuse you. Liam, is our lab submitted once we push changes? That's correct, Liam. And also the videos I have submitted talks a little bit about this. I will walk you through what I posted on Avenue. But the simple answer is that's the beauty of GitHub. Simply once you do a push, it gets populated to us as well. So that's your submission. You don't need to do anything special. Born after pushing my changes to my repository, it says that the autograder job failed. Does that mean my solution was incorrect? That means you failed some of the test cases, right? So you, well, simply if you just hit this red X mark, it takes you to the tests. But in fact, even before this, if you follow the lab 0 document, it shows you, well, you should be able to build your code on Eclipse, and Eclipse will print to you exactly the same message you see in GitHub. That's also one beautiful thing about the environment we are using, which is you really don't need to wait for GitHub or even for grading the lab to know what you have done. By running it locally, looking into the output messages, if you have something wrong in some of the test cases, the unit testing will tell you exactly what is the expected output and what is the output that your code. So what is the golden button? What is the correct output? And what is your program output? So you should be able to directly know that you have a problem, right? Can we resubmit after submitting? That's also, again, is explained in the videos that I have submitted. Yes, you can submit as many times as you wish. And in fact, Lab 0 also talks about this, like at the end of the document. Well, Lab 0 is very easy. Lab single line of code. Well, single line for the code itself and a couple of lines for the test case. But you can finish in one sitting. But when we come into future labs, those, I don't think there is a way you can finish in a single setting because they might take up like multiple hours or several hours to finish. What you are recommended to do, which is something also you should have as a good practice. If you go to industry, you see this all the case. You are working on a big project, it takes even months to finish. The good recommendation for revision control is in every setting you do some work in this project, you just do a submit, right? You submit your code because you don't want to lose changes, right? In that sense, for example, if you encounter before working on any big project and then your laptop crashes the deadline before, the day before the deadline, you don't have any problem, right? Because you have already keep submitting into GitHub, you already have the most up-to-date version there. So this also gives you a safeguard against any unexpected crashes or whatsoever. Okay, 3 tests means you are done. That's correct. Daniel, is it okay I push my personal account instead of my student account? No, that's not okay, Daniel. You should have accepted the assignment or the lab 0 through your student GitHub account, the one that you have your McMaster email on, and then you should be able to submit there, right? Tina, how many test cases should we include? I guess Lab 0 asks you only to include 1, if I remember correctly, but include as much as you wish. The more test cases, the better practice it is, right? Are they being called in another class along with the 2 example test cases? Yes, if you follow the process of how to add a test case similar to the existing ones, they should be called, right? I believe also in the videos I have, maybe it's the time right now to talk about these things. And like answer the question while I'm explaining them. So if I show you, let me share screen on the Avenue thing. come on. Okay, so I will share screen from here. This is this. You should be able to see my Avenue interface now. So if you go to Lab 0, you'll see 3 videos there, right? Those 3 videos I prepared from the last offering, but I made them focused on specific points. For example, in the first video, we'll talk about the GitHub basics, the commands. So I know that Aladdin has already went through this in the tutorial, but maybe in a quickly way, you guys had so many questions. So I found it might be good to have a reference video for you to visit, right? So you can think of these 3 videos as really a pretty like preparation for the Lab 0. The second one explains unit testing, the general concept, but also how it applies to the C, the Q test environment we are using for C. And it goes through the files one by one, how the test cases run. So also, Tina, you should find your answer, the answer to your question in this video. I hope so. And then finally, those that had questions about, well, I have a failing test case or a red X mark, or if it says OK 3 test, have I already passed? All of these questions related to the GitHub interface is kind of explained in this video as well, right? So I hope these 3 videos will help you a little bit with getting familiar with the environment, right? The other thing is if we go to announcements, some of the information that we already went through on lecture 0, Aladdin thankfully prepared an announcement here going through all of this. There was a question about when office hours are. Please watch lecture 0 because we went through this. Also, it's already on this announcement. It goes through the details of all the office hour details, lab sessions, and lectures, etc. Good. And the final thing I want to mention is please make sure when you send emails, use the protocol we kind of went through in Lab 0 and in lecture 0 as well. Make sure you include CompBench to SH4 in your title. First, email the main TA. Don't email me except that after 48 hours you didn't get a response from Aladdin, right? By doing so, I make sure every one of you get the response in a timely manner, right? If you don't follow this, it becomes a real mess, right? You can imagine having 300 students trying to email either me or the TA without following the protocol. We have already filtering in our mailboxes, so you might miss your email. So please make sure you follow this communication protocol such that we can help you in a timely manner. Is there any question related to these logistics? If there are any other lab questions that are basically technically lab questions, I highly recommend you go to office hours, because what we usually do in these office hours, it's the time where you can share a screen with the TA, like you say, well, I do so and so, but I face this problem. What is the solution, right? Doing this through the lecture will be very hard and take a lot of time. It's not the right venue to do that, right? But if you have any general question about logistics, please go ahead and ask. Yeah, other than this, we can start the real the real lecture itself. I might just reshare here. Okay, so I should just stop this full screen. Share. Just again, those slides are already on Avenue, so you should have access to them, right? Similar to what we have done last time. So usually my style when starting this course, it might be a little bit different because the traditional approach is to go through the rules, tell you, well, this is a syntax, this is how things 1, 2, 3, 4, these are the rules, as if we are reading from the language manual, and then we apply this, right? But I follow a different approach. What I try to do is, well, do some coding with you, hands-on, and then we go through the rules while we code. I hope this makes more sense to you, and it makes it more exciting and less boring. Instead of just hearing rules, you just see how they work, right? So let's start. So this time we'll also go through some C examples to get you introduced to the language. And then once we finish few of these examples, hopefully not in today's lecture, because I believe those examples will also be done on Wednesday. But once we do this on Thursday, we will go back, reflect on what we have wrote, and do the rules in a more formal way, right? So I hope you just understand the style I'm following, because otherwise you might get confused. So let's assume in this first example, we want to read 10 integers input from a user and output their sum. Last time, excuse me. So last time we did something, well, a little bit similar by reading 2 numbers from the user and then printing their multiplication, right? So it shouldn't be any different, right? Except that maybe if I told you to read 10 integers, how you can imagine doing this? Like from last lecture, we did the scanf, right? For 2 numbers. But should I do a single scanf for the 10 numbers? Or should I just do separate a scanf per number, right? What do you think? What you suggest? If you're going to write this code, how are you going to approach it? Feel free to write on the chat or use your mic to answer. Can we use a for loop, Aisha? Thank you. One scanf for all, Arthur. Yes. So Aisha kind of jumped a little bit further by saying loops, because if you said I will use a single scanf, well, this makes sense. It might be viable still for 10 numbers. What I told you, read 100 numbers from the user. Well, are you going to write like reading the 100 numbers? It's really very very tough to do so. Like what about 1,000, right? So then loops will play a role, right? And that's basically the main change between today's example and the last lecture example, right? So again, if I go through Python, well, I just simply write a very simple for loop saying for I in the range of 10, and then just do input, please input an integer. We said previously in Python, this is simply works as an input and output on the same time. So you output the instruction message, which is please input an integer, and you also read the input from the user, and then this will go to X, right? Inside the same for loop, because each time the user inputs something, it goes to X. So if you don't really update the sum in the next iteration, X will get overwritten by the new input, right? So you have to do the sum inside the for loop, right? Because each time you execute one iteration, X gets updated. So you have to keep track of the old inputted integers by the user, right? This is how simply we do it in Python. And then finally, I just print the sum, right? Observe that this is outside the for loop, right? So in Python, code blocks are determined by the spacing and tabs, right? So by having this tab, that means this is the for loop. And by going to the same level as the for loop, this means this printf is outside the loop. Hopefully you have already learned this in the first year. Good. Then the other thing is just initializing sum to 0. Let's say if I want to do this in C, how I can approach this, right? Let's quickly do this together. What I will do, I will share screen here and share with you my Eclipse. I hope you are able to see my Eclipse. How I move this. Okay, so what I will do, so I will also leverage this opportunity to show you while creating a new C project in Eclipse, something that usually also should be done as part of Lab 0, and Aladdin has already done this through the tutorial, but maybe it's good to reiterate, right? So I will just do new, and then I want a C++ project. I'm not sure if I share window in Teams, are you able still to see the other sub windows, or they disappear? Okay, good, because in Zoom it wasn't the case. And then, well, I need a C project, not a C++ one. And then because I'm using a Windows machine, let me just call this, I don't know, lecture 0. And this is lecture 2. And then something that's very important to do in the labs is don't use the default location, because the default location is your workspace location, unless your workspace is exactly the same place you do the labs in. Usually I have my labs in a different folder that I call 2sh for, like the same instructions you have in the lab document. And then what I'm going to do here, I'm going to create another folder. I'm going to call lecture 2. This will be my folder for the project, okay? And then I have to make sure I pick min.gw GCC, because that's my GCC tool chain in Windows. If you use Mac, I guess it's Xcode, right? but you should use the correct GCC toolchain per the lab manual instruction. I want this to be an empty project, and then I would just finish, right? And then I just switch to this. I will close this question 0 from zap 0, and then here I don't have any files. What I can do is I would say new file or source file. Then I would say I'm going to call this lecture2.c and finish. Here you get like an empty file editor to do your code, right? So first of all, we said last lecture we said this, every single project or program in C has to include one main and only one main, right? Because this is the starting point that the hardware is executing your code on. I'm doing a void main because I don't want to return anything. If I want to return 0, I will do int main, right? And then I will just do this. What did we say we want to achieve is reading two inputs to, oh, sorry, that's the previous lecture, 10 integers from user and print. Okay.
Yeah, that's what it seems like.
Okay, thanks for letting me know. So I would say, please, guys, like kind of stay sane, don't play around with the permissions. That's something good to know. Previously, I have used Zoom, so I was making sure all those security features are handled, but in Teams, I thought they are handled by default. So I should check the default settings. But for today, make sure, please, you don't mess around with your lecture, okay? Stay muted, don't mute me, and don't stop the recording. I appreciate that. Okay. So I went back with the recording. I hope the recording didn't miss much of the coding. We already didn't do much anyway. So we want to ask the user to input 10 integers, right? And in C, similar to what we said last time, the input and the output statements are separated. It's not like the input method in Python, right? Should I do this? Well, first of all, what is the correct function to really ask the user to input something, to print something on the screen? Do you remember from last time? What function did we use for that? Scanf, Ahmed, is for reading something from the screen, right? So that's scanning as an input. I want to tell the user, please input something. So that's the output, right? So it's a printf correctly. Should I do the printf inside the for loop, or where should I do it? Like if I do it inside the for loop, what happens? It will be repeated 10 times, right? So basically, if I say printf, each time I execute the iteration, it will be repeated 10 times. But I guess it makes more sense if we just put it before, because simply what happens is I want to print it once. Okay, and then maybe I'll just do a new line as well. Then what I'm forgetting here is the semicolon, right? And then by doing this, it's outside the loop and it should be print out. I'm forgetting something here, right? To be able to use printf, where is this defined, right? Simply every single function in your code should have an implementation somewhere, right? Where printf is being implemented. What I'm missing, studio.h, exactly. So what I should do here, I do an include, and this should be studio. Good. Then now this is asking the user to input 10 things inside the for loop. What should I do now? What is the step? I have already asked the user to input something. When I run this program, the message will print on the screen, right? So the user will start inputting stuff. How can I basically read it? Now with scanf, Tina, exactly. Yeah, I will come to your notes vector, but just give me a second. So yes, so right now I should do the scanf, right? So I'm doing a scanf, and then I'm reading an int. If you remember from last time, the specifier for this is the D, right? And then now where the input will go through. In Python, it was X, right? And we said we need this and to be able to modify X. But what is the problem with this line of code? If you look into this red line here, it tells you symbol X couldn't be resolved. What does it mean? What is the problem with that?
I think X needs to be defined.
Exactly, Hakam. Thank you. And thanks, Tina, on the chat. Abdul Nasser as well. Yes, X is not defined. So we should here define int X equals 0 for initialization as well. So by doing this, you'll see this red thing have already went away. So inside the for loop right now, I'm going to read X. And then I should update my sum, right? So I should just sum equals sum plus X. Again, what is the problem? I didn't really define sum, right? In Python, again, it's no problem, but here it wouldn't work, right? So you need also to define sum and maybe just initialize it, right? This makes sense? So at the end, after adding the sum all the time, maybe I will do this to be able to show you. There's no way to zoom in, but I believe in Teams, you guys are able to zoom in your own client screen if you wish, right? So after updating the sum for 10 times, I should just print the sum right now. Should I print the sum here or should I print it here? What might be the difference? If I print the sum outside the loop, yeah, it doesn't work for Eclipse. Eclipse does not support control per scroll. I guess control per scroll will work in your own client screen if you want to zoom whatever the sharing is, right? The sum is, and then I just print the sum. Again, you need a specifier here, and then you just do sum, right? If I do this, the sum will only get printed once after you do the for loop and finish, right? So let's see, right? So right now we wrote this program. Let's try to run it also to go through what you need to do in your Eclipse. First of all, I need to build my project, right? So I will do project build project. Hopefully we don't have a problem. Undefined reference to when main. Interesting, because it seems that I might have, again, Eclipse might not be recognizing my min.gw path. And that's really bad because it means we'll not be able to run this without a restart. Oh, but I already tried lab 0 and it worked fine. That's quite interesting. Oh, but I didn't do any return. This might be the problem. Let me see. Still, yeah, that error means, well, there is a problem with the tool chain. Okay, that's bad to hear. I just wanted to walk you through Eclipse. Maybe you can do this next time. So let me quickly go to, but just to let you know, if you face this error, it's more about Eclipse is not recognizing your min.gw line GDP, your min.gw path, right? So some machines would require a restart. The interesting part is I have already done this and I finished lab 0 in this environment anyway. Online GDB. Then see, then I will switch sharing screen quickly. Window this thing. Then just have that. So let's, I guess you are able to see the other window, right? So I would just do run. Please input 10 integers to get the sum. So I'm just inputting, well, let's say 1, and then 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Then finally the sum is basically the sum of 1 to 10, right? Which is 55, right? Does this make sense? So I'll stop here, take questions, and then we'll be around with this work. Try to modify it a little bit. Let me quickly scan questions. Again, please follow if you have a question to be able to quickly scan it, put it in square brackets. Okay. Where is that? Since we are not modifying the value of X, do we really need to the AND symbol? How many? Well, aren't we modifying the value of X? So here, I guess the question is saying, well, X value is not modified. Is it the case? It's already modified, right? Originally, before executing this function, X was 0, right? So it's like initial value is 0. But then after reading something from the input, X becomes this inputted number. So it becomes 1 and then 2 and then 3, right? So scanf is already modifying X, right? This is why we need the AND, right? Question. Can we go through each line of the code? Yeah, I will do this, Ghayas, but let me quickly, as answer questions, I will quickly explain it and then modify it as well. So does the for statement line not need at the end of the, that's a good question, Suhail. We'll talk about this. Okay, so I guess Suhail's question is the following. So this is a statement in C. We said every single statement in C should end up with a semicolon, right? But we don't end the for loop with a semicolon, right? Why that's the case? Because in fact, this line is not a single statement. In C, the full for block is the statement itself, right? And because this is a block of code, not a single statement, it does not require a semicolon at the end. So those curly brackets are already replacing this. But every single statement inside the for body would require a semicolon, similar to what we have here, right? In fact, if you add a semicolon here, it will complain, right? Or it might, well, it depends on the compiler again, because some compilers allow you to have empty lines ending with a semicolon, right? But it doesn't really mean that this semicolon is for this for loop. It's as if you have something here, right? Like it's an empty line. But I believe most compilers will complain also about this. Good. So now let's quickly go through the code, explain a little bit, and then we see if we want to modify it and use it for an interactive, I would say, more questions, right? So what are we doing here? Again, that's the main function that we have used previously. We said every single program would require a single main. Here I'm returning int because at the end I'm saying return 0. We said this can be void if you are not returning anything. And in that sense, you just comment this line out. But we said it's a good practice to have return type as int, and you return 0, which indicates you don't have any problem, right? We will talk about exact function syntax in a detailed lecture, but for now you should know that the way we write functions in C, you put the return type in front of the function, that's the name of the function, and between those brackets, you would have any input arguments. Here we don't have any input arguments, so we just input nothing, right? Later on, we will use our own functions, right? But that's basically a function definition. This takes us to another thing, is how to use functions. And here we are using two functions in our program. We are using printf and scanf, right? The way we use these functions is we just call them and we pass the input arguments that are defined by this function. For example, here for printf, we are passing a string, right? So printf as a function implemented in Studio.h is expecting a string formatted in a certain way, and that's the input we are sending to the printf, right? For scanf, here it's taking two inputs. The first one is the format. The second one is the input parameter that is going to modify, okay? So again, we have a separate lecture for the function, but just quickly understand what is the syntax here, good? So what we want to do in this program is to read 10 integers from the user and then print their sum. To be able to read 10 integers from a user, we need a placeholder to read these integers too, right? Which in this case is our variable x. So the purpose of x, as we do in this scanf, is each time the user inputs something like the 1, 2, just take this. I guess here I'm able to make it a little bit bigger as well. To input 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. Those are being stored in x each time, right? And then I want to add the sum into sum, right? So like basically x each time is added to the original sum. Initially sum is 0, and then sum will be 1 because 0 plus 1, and then it will be 1 plus 2, and then it will be 3 plus 3, right? If I really want to track this, and that's one of the modifications we will do right now, I can really print the sum in every single iteration, right? So I say sum is this, and then in fact I would say, well, I might redo something. Yeah, the sum. Let me also do this. X is that, and then it will be X, and the sum is that. So, and then here I'm also printing X, right? Just to keep track of things, right? And then I may just quickly run again. I will input 10 things quick. Yeah, but you see here, once I input one thing from the scanf, before inputting the second one, I got this message printed. Why that's the case? Because I have taken it from outside the loop and put it inside the loop, which means it's being printed every single iteration, right? Here, x is 1. That means x is updated from 0 to 1 because here the user inputted 1, and the sum is 1 because simply 0 plus 1, right? And then if I just do an int and then enter 2, well, x is 2 and the sum now is 3, right? And then if it's 3, x is 3, and then 3 plus 3 is 6, etc., 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 right? So you see that somehow it's updated in every single iteration, right? Okay, does this make sense? Question, why won't the project build? If there's something related to Eclipse, I wouldn't. If you're asking about my own Eclipse, why it didn't build? Because again, it seems that my Eclipse for some reason now does not recognize the min-GW path. Remember in lab 0, there is a very specific instruction on how to add the min-GW path into your own system path such that Eclipse recognizes it, right? I will look into it later and hopefully in Wednesday lecture should be fixed. But now for like, let's focus on the example itself. If this is related to your own Eclipse, I would say drop to the office hours and hopefully you should get the help. Aiden, can you explain how the variable sum and x were initialized using this syntax? In some, okay, so that's okay. That's a good thing. That's also one of the things we wanted to modify. What I'm doing right now, we will define a variable called x. It has the type of int, and I'm initializing it to value 0, right? I can do the initialization using a different way. It's still running, so I just stop. I'll comment this line. I will define x. This is called variable declaration. We have a separate lecture for this. And then I'm initializing x equals 0, right? These two lines are completely equivalent in effect to this one, correct? Yes, that makes sense, right? Then something else I can do. This is a block of code now. I'm just commenting all of this. If I want to define x and sum in the same line, I can do something like int x equals 0 and then sum equals 0. I'm defining two variables, x and sum, because both are int. I'm separating them with a normal colon, not a semicolon, and I'm also initializing them on the same line, right? That's basically some kind of a shortcut way of defining two variables of the same type and initializing them on the same line, right? If you don't want to initialize both, but you want to initialize only one of them, for example, you only want to initialize sum, then that's fine as well, right? X will not get initialized to 0. Good. I hope this explains your question, Aiden. This takes us to another important thing. Why do we really need to initialize the variables to 0? What if we didn't initialize them? What do you think? And here, in fact, we have two different cases, x and sum. Let's take them one by one. X. What if I didn't initialize x? Was there be any problem? Based on this logic we have here, if x had no initial value or had a garbage, because later on we will explain in detail that C, if you don't initialize the variable, it gets whatever value was there before in the memory, right? So it can be anything, right? Does this affect our program in any way? What do you think? Any guess? Liam, yes, exactly. It's fine because we rewrite x before using it, right? So here, I'm really reading x. I never use x before really overwriting it by the scanf. So whatever initial value x has, well, no problem because it's going to be overwritten. What about sum? What if I didn't initialize sum to 0? Now it's a different case because you use sum here, right? So the way we wrote the logic, if sum wasn't initially 0, it would get in the very first time we execute this statement, you will take the original value of sum, which if it's not 0, it can be anything from the memory. And then the sum now will be wrong because you will, for example, if sum was originally 100 because you had 100 stored in the memory from another program, then you will be adding 100 to x. So here sum initialization is really mandatory, right? So what is the rule? If you are using a variable, well, if you are defining a variable, but overwriting it before using it. So overwriting means the first time it appears straight on the left-hand side of the expression, right? So if you are overwriting it before using it, then no problem. You don't need to initialize. But if you are using it, using its original value before initializing it, that's risky. So you have to initialize it. Might sound confusing. You really don't need even to worry about it. What should be a good programming practice, especially in C? Any variable you define, just initialize, right? This is really, even if you know it's going to be overwritten, it will not cause you any harm, right? So it's like you will find us a lot during lectures. We talk about programming practices, like something that usually professional programmers do to make sure the programs, especially very large programs, don't get problems that are unexpected. So it's a very good practice to, anyway, initialize your variables. Okay, so here I'm just adding this back to 0. Good. Okay, so what else? Because time is running out, so I will again switch back to, or maybe just I will read from slides. You already have this, and then modify the program accordingly. Well, all the variants you have in your slides are mainly about different ways of writing the code. Yeah, one thing that you'll also find with the slides, and I guess someone already pointed this out on the chat, is here we have the printf before the for loop, which means it's only printed once, right? Something we can write to be more convenient to the user is well, I might just keep this as is, but then here I would say please input integer number something to tell the user what is the current index of the current integer. For example, the first one, it will be the first integer, the second one is the second one, etc., etc. For you, what should I put here? What do you think? And that's really a bonus mark. If someone identifies the exact value here, well, I will get their name and they will get a bonus mark, right? So if I want to tell the user, please input integer 1 and then integer 2. Tim, that's correct. The first one, oh no, Ahmad, the first one is the first to go in. Okay. So Ahmad, please give me your name afterwards. Send me privately on the chat. So it should be I plus 1, because I is the one keeps tracking of the iteration, and I want it to be 1 and 2 and 3, but I is initially 0, so it's I plus 1. Okay. If I do this, it seems to be more convenient. So I say, please input in integers. Then now input integer number 1. I will enter 1. I will print the sum, and then please input integer number 2 and print 2. I might just want to separate this by a new line, just to to keep it like more formatted. Okay. Okay, good. So what else we have here? The sum of the odd ones. Okay, that's a good addition, and this may be the one that we can stop at. So if you look into example 2 in slide 12, it tells, well, I want to modify this code a little bit to only print the sum of the odd numbers, not every number. So far what we have done is we printed the sum of everything. So here in sum equals sum plus x, I always add x to the sum, no matter what is the value of x, right? We want to modify this a little bit to only add x to the sum if x is odd, right? First of all, how do I determine whether x is odd or not? What might be the logic, right? Before even thinking about syntax, how you determine whether a number is odd or not? Or if it's divisible by 2, right? Then it means it's even, otherwise it's odd, right? So like thinking logically right now, this statement will have to be conditional, right? So I don't want to always do it. I want to do it based on a certain condition. For you, yes, exactly. We use an if statement, right? So once we think about conditions, I need some sort of if statement. And this if statement will depend on the value of x, right? As some of you already wrote, if x mod 2, mod is this percent in C, right? If x mod 2 does not equal 0, that means it's odd, right? Otherwise, it's even, right? And then I only execute the code inside this if statement, right? So what I'm writing here, I'm saying Well, previously I was adding x to the sum all the time. Right now I no longer want to do this. I only want to add x to the sum if x is odd. That's the logic. What this line is doing is simply encoding this in a programming way, saying, well, how do I know whether x is odd or not? I will do x mod 2. If it is not 0, that means it's not even, it's an odd number. And then, well, I will just get do the sum. So given that we are talking about odd and even and divisible by 2, I could rewrite this. Well, by the way, this is not equal, right? So that's the logic of not equal in C, right? And this is mod. So x mod 2 not equal 0. If I wanted to rewrite this line, how I would rewrite it? By using equal instead of not equal. What do you think? If I want to do something like equal, what would I write here? 1, right? Because, well, we're talking about odd. So if x mod 2 is 1, then that's an odd number, right? It's either 0 or 1. That's that basically because we are dividing by 2, right? Good. This makes sense. Okay. Good. So let's just try to run this and see what do we get. Oh, that's something that is good to know. In C is case sensitive, as we will see in a later lecture. X capital is not equal to x small, right? So this is a variable that is not defined anywhere because what I defined here is x small, right? This has to be that. Some languages are not case sensitive. If you have ever dealt with MATLAB before, MATLAB is not case sensitive, right? That's something to pay attention to. Well, if I remember correctly, it's a long time since I used MATLAB. What about return 0? I guess I'm missing something. What is that? Well, I commented this line out. I added an if statement. I have like a closing bracket, but I don't have an open one, right? Good. So input 1, and then x is 1 and the sum is 1. Why? Because 1 is odd. If I enter 2, x is 2, but the sum is still 1 because 2 is even, so it's not being added, right? Remember, here we changed the logic to only add if x is odd, right? If I enter 3, well, right now is 3 plus 1, which is 4, right? You can imagine if I enter 4, nothing will change in the sum, right? This makes sense? So let's see questions. How many? When I try to build the program, it builds the question 1 to C from lab 0 instead. Yes, because how many you need, or that's an Eclipse specific thing, but in the left pane, you should select your project that has your code. For example, I called it lecture 2, and then you do build project. So you have, because Eclipse is selecting your lab 0 because most probably this is the project you have been working on previously, right? Okay, good. Is there any question in this modification? Maybe we can play around with it a little bit. What if I want to change my logic such that it's still running? What if I want to change my logic? I still want to really only add the odd numbers, but I want to write my if statement to be like this. What can I do? Still, I want only to add. I want only to add the odd numbers, but I want this to be like that. What can I do? Tina, if I return, the whole program will close, right? It wouldn't like, because return is returning from the function itself. Exactly, you want to exit the loop, but how we really, well, do I really want to exit the whole loop, not reading the remaining numbers? I want only to skip this one, right? Do nothing basically for you, right? We will see later on if you want to skip a certain iteration, break the whole loop, right? Well, do x equals 0? Let's think a little bit. This logic means x is even, right? I guess you are all trying to think of what I do inside here. Good, but let's leave this for now. When do I want to add x? I want to add it if it's odd. So I should use an else statement, right? And then put this inside, because that means x is even, and in the else case, it's odd, right? And that's the logic of if else, as we will see later on, right? Here, what I'm doing, well, some of you already said continue. that's correct. Continue is a reserved word, means just skip this following iteration. This will be working fine. Or maybe if I just want to print something, if you want to leave the continue syntax for now, I can just print the remaining thing just to make sure I really didn't add anything, right? And then else, I will just put this inside there, right? So in this case, I'm not really adding at all. I'm just printing, but in the else, I'm adding and printing, right? You can also add 0 to the sum if you wish. RG, so it's basically you want to say I do nothing. That also can work, right? This makes sense? Okay. So example 3. Should we go through example 3 quickly? Yeah, so that's something we can easily modify and then we'll stop there. So example 3 is saying you really want to read integers input by the user until the first one and the output their sum. So right now I'm changing a little bit the logic. Just first of all, understand the problem. But let me see if you have any questions. We can address them. Otherwise, we'll quickly go through the other modification. But I want to make sure you get this first. Does this make sense? Is this modification that we only do a logic based on whether it's odd or even is modifying it? Couple of questions. Nicholas, my program keeps expecting scanned integers before it even prints. Please input in. So that means you are doing a scanf somewhere before this printf. So you have to check where's scanf. If you initialize a variable and you don't declare its value, what default value does it take? I guess, well, it's not called initialize anymore, RG. I guess what you meant is if you declare a variable and don't initialize it, then it gets whatever value was there in the memory. It's called like garbage. Like basically it's the old value. Later on, we will explain in detail how the low-level hardware is allocating or declaring a variable for you. Once you declare an int x, the x will be stored in the memory in a certain place. This place can really have old value from some other program, and this is the value that x will have. Why something divided by 2 would be 0 if it's even? Well, Sana, think about it. Like take any even number divided by 2. Oh, that's not the result of the division. That's a modulus operation, right? So that's the remainder of the division, right? Sana? So this is a modulus operation, not a division operation. Okay. So the remainder, if you divide any even by 2, the remainder will always be 0, right? Okay, so I'd say maybe I will stop here because of the time is over, and maybe on Wednesday we'll start from example 3. I will stay for a few minutes to take questions if you have any, but I guess feel free to leave if you don't have any other question. Thanks. Let me look into your question. Int num equals 0 and sum equals 0. Please input this. For this sum, I don't see you have. Oh yeah, it seems that you are not defining. You are not including studio.h, Hauman, right? Because printf and scanf should include studio.h. Please include studio.h. Are there any other questions in the chat? Right, yes, question. So x means that the number is even because the remainder is correct. Yes. Rita, could you explain line 21? 21, this one. Yeah. Okay, so that's a for loop statement. This is the syntax we do it in C compared to Python. Again, we will cover it in a later lecture in more detail, but the syntax is the following. The first statement, like for block, has 3 main things, right? To be able to do a loop, you need 3 main things. You need a counter, you need a condition to exit your loop, and because this is a counter, you need to do your increments, right? That's simply any iteration, whether it's while or for loop or any kind of iteration in coding, you need these 3 things. So the first line here, we are defining a variable called I, and then we're initializing it to 0. By the way, that is allowed in more modern C standards, but in the old standards, you cannot initialize and declare inside the loop. So it should be just I, and then I equals 0 should be here, That's the more, I would say, conservative way of doing it, right? But then, so here I'm initializing my counter. The last statement I'm saying that, well, maybe I just wrote it in a way that is not very clear. This is simply just I equal I plus 1, right? Okay, so I equal I plus 1. But simply you can write it like this, or in C++ means add 1. So it's an increment, okay? And again, we will come into operators in a later lecture. The middle one is your condition. So it says I will keep in this loop as far as I value is less than 10. So if I'm starting from 0, incrementing by 1 each time, I will keep saying like 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 until 9. 9 is less than 10. That's correct. You do your iteration and your increment. In the next one, I will be 10. Is 10 less than 10? No, then you exit, right? This is how you interpret your for loop logic. Okay. Oh, now I see how, man. You are using single quotes. You have used double quotes, okay? Your code. Kaiden, what is the purpose of the and? Okay, so Kaiden, we explained this in the previous lecture, but let me quickly reiterate, okay? So usually functions in C, as we were explaining at the beginning of this lecture, they expect input arguments. For example, in the main here, I take no input at all because that's my starting point. And then this is my return value, okay? Scanf takes these two as input arguments. Usually functions don't change input arguments because they are input, right? If you want a function in C to modify your input, you have to add this and, which means you are sending this input argument, what we call send by reference, which means I'm allowing scanf to modify X. Okay, that's how we interpret it for now. Later on, again, we will discuss in detail what we mean by passing by reference. But for now, you should interpret the and is in allowing scanf to modify X. You can revisit last lecture to see in detail if we remove this and what would happen, right? You will get a warning and X will not be modified, okay? Arthur, when I load Eclipse, sometimes it will not let me type in the terminal and the terminal will not have the correct name either. That's more like a specific lab question. Arthur, I would say, please, yeah, maybe you can just drop into the office hours and you can share a screen and we'll look into it, okay? Are there any further questions? Yes, in the printf statement, what does the xSum bar do exactly? xSum bar, I guess you might be referring to this one. So here, I'm just saying I want to print this statement, but the powerful point about printf in C, it can be formatted to really kind of have placeholders where you can substitute them with actual values, right? So what I'm doing here is X is equal something. What is this something? As we said last time, this will be the first input parameter afterwards. So X, this specifier will be replaced by the actual value of X. As we have seen in the output, X is 1 and then 2 and then 3 and then 4. Each time it gets updated by the actual value of X. And then I'm printing the sum as well, but this is a placeholder to replace with the sum value, okay? Oh, Lawrence, no. Studio.h is in fact, we also said this last time, is part of the C standard library. So it has nothing to do with Lab 0, right? The Studio.h is a header file that is included by the C standard library, which is part of your C tool chain, right? So it's not related to Lab 0. You can use in any other program. Why can't we just put for I equals 0, I9, I'm aware it's wrong, but not sure why. Because that's syntax, Ahmed, right? So every language has its own syntax. For example, in Python, you can just say I in range 0 to 9, right? And then, because it's high level. But in C, again, you have more fine-grained control. Later on, when we discuss for loops in detail, you will see, in fact, that you can play around with all these conditions. You can say, for example, well, maybe I just don't have an increment at all, and this is allowed in C. Maybe I don't have an exit logic and my exit logic will be inside, and that's also allowed in C, right? So C gives you the freedom. This is why the syntax is a little bit more detailed, okay? On the other hand, For example, what if I is not I don't want it to be incremented by 1. I want it to be incremented by 2 or 4, or incremented in some sort of expression that is not regular expression, right? Not adding 2 every time, for example. That's something you can do as well, right? Peter, are we okay to use flush standard out? I'm not sure if flush is part of the C standard library. I guess what you want to do here is you want to clear your output screen. But I don't think this is the syntax of doing that, because my output is out of order without it. So you have already tried using it and it works. Then I don't know what you mean by out of order. So maybe, yeah, again, please, Peter, that may be a specific question. We need to look into your screen and understand exactly what you mean by that. Yash, what is when man 16? I'm getting an error. Yeah, that's exactly the same error I got, Yash, right? So I believe my guess here is Eclipse is not recognizing the path of your main GW. If you open Lab 0 document, it tells you exactly how to add the path into your own operating system variables. You might need to do a restart afterwards. Okay, if the problem is still there and didn't get solved, please come to the office hours and I believe we'll be able to help you with that. Okay. Okay, so thanks everyone. I guess let's continue example 3 on Wednesday then. Hopefully you start working on Lab 0 as soon as possible, and then make use of the videos that I just posted. If you still got questions, make use of the office hours, share a screen with the TAs, and hopefully you get the help that you need. Once you have your environment done in Lab 0, everything afterwards in other labs should be very smooth. It's exactly the same way you do every other lab, right? Thanks everyone. Have a good day. Bye-bye.